Well, yes, I apologise. I am repeating some of the things said by others, but I'm saying them in a slightly different way. And in one case, perhaps I agree, which is that Eglantine Jebb actually produced her study, a brief study in social questions, in 1906, before the First World War. And I want to start with that because there are two kinds of changes I'm looking at and want to assess. One is the one that Jebb herself represents, which is that she's a member of something called the National Union of Women Workers, which is an organisation of people who do social work, social investigation. The word worker for a middle-class person often means precisely that you do social work, philanthropy, all the people that we've been talking about in certain instances, particularly for the Cambridge Charitable Organisations Society. And she, at the age of 30, she was born in 1876, was in Cambridge looking after her ill mother, living in the house of her uncle, who was a professor at the university at the time, Richard Claverhouse Jebb. And she was a friend and connection of Florence Ada Keynes, very famous in this town, mother of John Maynard and Margaret, and leading activist in the same fields as Jebb was to dominate. And the work they do helps us see something of the past of women's work. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to apologise now. We don't get very much from individual women manual workers. People don't ask them much at the time. They don't get a chance to speak. I've tried to find instances, but not found very many. But I wanted to start there because that is one change I do see happening over predominantly the First World War. And I'm afraid I've spent a lot of my life looking at the First World War, and it still captivates and interests me. So I've spent more time looking at it than I have the Second, and I'm only going to give a bare sketch of what happens during the Second and after the Second World War. But that's precisely because I think one big change happens after the Second World War and the other happens in the interwar period. So I'm starting with Jebb, but I'm also starting with her because she does a very remarkable thing. I'm just making sure I know what I'm doing. Sorry, I'm going back to that one later. She does a very good piece of social investigation. We saw that wonderful map that was drawn by another chronicler of Cambridge life, Gwen Raverett, as she becomes, who writes an account of her childhood in period peace, also in West Cambridge. But that map was drawn by her. She was a descendant of the Darwin family. Eglantine Jebb started her investigation prompted by Florence Ada Keynes, wanting to know what was happening in Cambridge, why there was male unemployment, why social conditions were so poor, why the Cambridge Charitable Organisations Society, to which Jebb and Mrs. Keynes belonged, were finding so many people in need of relief. In other words, one of the areas of great wealth in England as a whole was a place where there were poor physical conditions, dangers of disease and other things, and Jebb was to look at it, and she did proper social investigation based mostly on comments from other members of the Cambridge Charitable Organisations Society, the CCOS, based on their casebooks, and we heard a lot about those earlier. And they are a brilliant source for describing the lives of the poor, but perhaps not all the lives of the poor, because as was said earlier, the respectable poor are the ones who get picked up by the CCOS. The unrespectable poor have to take their chances with the poor law. So these are the people who live in houses, who have residents, who have perhaps families that they need to support. But what she finds in her investigations are things that are quite shocking about household life in this poor area of the city that we're talking about today. She finds acute poverty and poor physical conditions, particularly in housing. And in the parish of St Andrew the Less, and just as a parenthesis. I was asked to talk about the parish of St Andrew the Less, of which I, of course, had not, I'm sorry to say, heard. And I went to try to find out where it was and where the civil parish, the administrative district for censuses and the like, was. And even the census takers don't really appear to have known. If you look at the list for the 1921 census, they've crossed it out in several places and sent it off to another parish, and it includes 3 different census enumeration districts. So I still don't know exactly where the parish of St Andrew the Less is, but I've looked mostly at Barnwell and just around there, rather than Mill Road, as everyone else has done.
St Andrew the Less administratively does cover the whole of Sturton town. And although
Yes, it does. Yes.
They've got their own churches,
Yes.
Barnabas and St Matthew.
They have proper parishes. Yes, the civil parish. Yes, you can find it. Wonderful Mary, who has been so helpful, shows me in a dotted line on some Ordnance Survey maps, but even that isn't very clear. You're not always sure what the dotted line you're looking at represents. But what she found was that, for example, simple physical qualities, sewage and water are pretty poor, despite the Cambridge Water Company, despite other innovations like gas and electric light. These houses, some in this area, 15 houses are sharing a tap, one standpipe to get their water. Secondly, they share lavatories. They don't even have just the one in the back garden. They share it with other houses. They're not all equipped with mains sewage or mains water properly. And the reason that I am emphasising these poor conditions in the housing of this area is that the conclusion I came to in doing the preliminary research for this, and it is still rather a preliminary piece of work, is that household work is so important to the working women, whatever their formal occupation. Household labour in this period is exceptionally arduous and uncongenial. And Jeb herself comments of their lives with some poignancy. She says that they are unable to have any recreation or leisure because they are so worn out by the need for extensive labour, exhausted throughout. And she talks about destitution and misery. So it's not just the formal claimants for relief, whether it's the Poor Law or the CCOS who are in this state. Many of these respectable working people are not earning enough wages. And one of the reasons for that is that some of the occupations in Cambridge at this time are people employed by the colleges, and the wages in the colleges are very low. So you might well need relief if you're working for the colleges because your wages are not enough to support you. And women in particular often work in relation to the college students and their lives, which also means that their employment is quite seasonal. The vacations are times in which there is not much work to be done, they don't get paid so much. Other occupations that employ women in 1906 include, as we've seen, the making of jam and canned fruit and fruit syrups and the like by Chivers, but there are other places as well. Chivers have several workplaces. They have so many workers, in fact, that they run special trains twice a day. Somebody may have mentioned this earlier, I wasn't sure, I didn't hear it if they did. From the station at Barnwell, which goes out on the Mildenhall line to the factory in Impington and another one in Histon, I think. They work in laundries, which are seasonally affected by the undergraduates and the fellows of the colleges being in residence. And they work in service in all sorts of houses, both for people who teach in the university and people who study there. But they also work in service for those many entrepreneurs, builders, and producers of new wealth and new enterprises that we heard about earlier. So that there is a lot of service work. And Eglantine Jebb's figures, and I think they're pretty accurate, sees 400 women working for colleges, predominantly as bedmakers, 620 organising lodgings, again, predominantly for students, but for other visitors as well, and 600 working in laundries. These are the big occupations of women. An American sociologist in the 60s talked about women's work as the 5 C's: cooking, caring, cleaning, cashiering, and clerking. Sorry, slightly Americanized language. But these are good summaries of women's work in Britain, apart from industrial cities where large numbers of women are machinists and elsewhere. And Cambridge is not that much different. The balance is different because of the presence of the colleges and their dominance. But their work is also arduous because those poor physical conditions, things like working in cement works or shoveling coal, are filthy, and cleaning the bodies of household members needs extensive work. Carrying the water, heating the water, preparing the bath, cleaning the surfaces. And the health of Cambridge people in the poorer parts of the city is poor. And there is this shocking statistic of 819 births registered in 1904. 107 of those babies died in the first year of life. 1 in 8 usually dies, somebody said in her book. She talks about the possibility of improving these conditions, and Cambridge sees, as many English cities do, schools for mothers, cookery schools, belief that the mothers are responsible for the poor health of their households, a belief which Jeb herself doesn't particularly share, and nor do most of the heroines of my story who are social activists in Cambridge. But she does, she's much less radical in her 30s than she is to be later, talking about child referees and child hunger after the First World War. But she said the mothers need to be acquainted with the nutritive qualities of soup. And when people set up for the unemployed and the poor schools for mothers or cookery kitchens, these have very little effect. However, I will go on to my next hero later. What I want to do very quickly is look. Now, I apologize, I'm technically very inept. This is a screenshot of part of this wonderful map that some of you will have seen, that was made by Historic Towns of Cambridge, and it takes the 1927 Ordnance Survey map and puts on it historical buildings of the past or at the time, so that you've got, somebody else showed this earlier, you've got light purple for enterprises, industrial and food production, and here we see that this Cambridge, as well as cement works and railway works and schools, large numbers of schools for those large numbers of small children that are being born in the east side of the city, churches, halls, places of entertainment. There's a theatre running down to Midsummer Common. Have I gone that far along? No, I haven't, have I? I'm still in Barnwell. There are lecture halls. There is, of course, later, shortly, there is to be on Mill Road, the first purpose-built cinema in Cambridge. There are places of leisure and pleasure, and above all, in Cambridge at about this time, as Jeb reports, being a temperance advocate, 136 public houses. One every 36 yards, she says. And these, I had a quick look at the list of the ones that belong to the Star Brewery, which is the biggest in the city at this time, which are concentrated, Mill Road, what is now King Street, some on Fitzroy Street, City Road, East Road. And that means that the people who live this side of the city have got more pubs per household, well, probably more households per yard, actually, than the west part of Cambridge. And Jeb's comments about drink and its adverse influence on the health of the city are pertinent to some extent. in that there are frequent cases in the magistrates' court of men beating up women and women seeking separation orders to protect themselves from violent men. But by the time the First World War comes along, we find that Cambridge employment in the first year of war actually falls for women. And it falls because partly of the speedy mobilisation of young men from the university colleges and young men who volunteer from the city in that first great enthusiasm for mobilisation for war. And as a result, 1/3 of lodging houses only are being occupied in those first years of war. Many of the restaurants serving university people and the soldiers that replace them are kept under quite tight discipline when they appear in their tent cities on Jesus Green and the lawns in front of Trinity College. And the east part of the city doesn't see very much of these soldiers. They're rather kept away from the city streets and they move on very quickly. We often forget that Cambridge in its past is a small market town feeding quite a large population, into which come, through the stockyards and railway sidings, large numbers of animals. They have large numbers of horses coming through, going off to the front eventually. Female employment falls also because some people sack their servants. They think it's time for economy, for tightening their belts, for looking for deprivations to come. But employment does pick up in 1915. Many women volunteer. My second major heroine, Leah Manning, volunteers as a member of the voluntary aid detachment, most of whom are nurses of some sort, but can also be clerks and cleaners and doing jobs which men might do, but the women can do, and the men can then be sent off to fight. In Cambridge, the jobs in the east of the city are pretty much manual work. They're not what you might call exciting opportunities. They're arduous, they're dirty, they're poor hours, they demand physical strength and nourishment. And women do take these jobs. They go and they shovel coal, in particular, at the gasworks. I've got 2 photos of them doing that. And this one is one demanding a little bit of knowledge. It's sifting coal. This one is perhaps the most famous. This is them on the heaps beside the gas. Oh, I've forgotten the name of them. What are they called? Ometer. Gasometer. That's it, yes, gasometer. These women are wearing, you note, gaiters or breeches. They're trousered. They are wearing hats to keep their hair out of their eyes, to keep it clean because it gets filthy. And they are not really wearing uniforms. These are not people in public service. The other ones that do get written up in the newspapers, commented on, referred to as people doing new women's work, are those introduced in the teeth of opposition by many local employees, as elsewhere in England, to do jobs that men do, and thus release unskilled or semi-skilled men into the forces. And as the need for troops gets greater, as the war settles down to being a war on the western front of trenches, we find large numbers of jobs that women have done in the past, but not very much, routinely being done by women. Again, arduous jobs demanding control of horses, heavy milk churns, collecting money, meeting the public face to face, things that previously women were thought unsuited to do. Farmers are the most resistant to employing women in this area. Again and again, men appear before munition tribunals saying, I must keep this man on my farm, I must keep them in my stockyard. Women cannot handle meat, they can't handle animals, and woman after woman turns up saying, I'd like to handle animals, I'd like to handle meat, and it's difficult for them to get employment. There are women who are known as stockmen who do this job, handle the animals, but very few. And some of these farmers get their way. The munition tribunals in Cambridge are quite sympathetic to farmers who don't want to lose skilled men providing essential food. Farms that don't provide essential food get less favourable a response. And these are probably, again, also controversial. The railways takes on women to clerk, to clean, to correspond, to do signals, but not to drive trains. They're thought to be, or they can be guards, but they can't do the clicking the carriages together and so on. And again, it's quite resisted. But the railways function very successfully with women, as does the postal service. The postal service in the First World War is extraordinary. The army has 4 collections and deliveries a day at the front. I mean, not for each individual soldier, but in general, these are going on. And they reduced the post in the First World War to 2 a day, which is really quite remarkable. And that is thanks to these younger women, although they like to employ women over 24. They don't want young ones, they want strong ones who can ride bicycles or ride motorbikes even. And you see, these are uniform service. They will have war service badges. They will have war service conditions. They are guaranteed to be paid the rate of a skilled man at the job they are doing if they replace a skilled man. They'll get a protected time rate if they don't. But they're all let in to do these jobs under agreement with trade unions or trade bodies, as for the duration only. They are what is called either dilutees or substitutes, and both are there on the understanding that if they've replaced a man, that man will get the job back after the war. And that is with the agreement of women's trade unions, because what it does is to ensure that the trade unions are not divided by a gender war. I'm running out of time, aren't I? Have I? I can't remember who's my... Oh, okay. Oh, good. Okay. And much of the public attention is given to these women in uniform or doing specific war jobs. This kind of service job, which these women are doing for the Corporation of Cambridge, the City Council, only tends to be controversial when it arouses some sort of slightly titillatory interest. First, to wear trousers. And now I've shown you some people working on the gas heaps, the coal heaps at the gas factory. These are probably actually only wearing trousers. And the munition workers who I know so much about elsewhere, and there are very few munitions workers in Cambridge at all under the Munition of War Acts, which are quite wide-ranging. The test case in 1915 is railway wagons that might carry munitions. A few of them wear trousers, and they attract the same interest, and interestingly, get equal pay, completely equal pay. Most women do not get equal earnings because men get war bonuses, because they need more money in the First World War to look after. The family wage applies to them. But they're all posed, just like the photographs we saw earlier. They're posed for a newspaper photographer. There are some better photographers who take photographs for the Imperial War Museum, who start recording what women have done in the war in 1917, particularly the great Horace Nichols, who photographs munition workers and grave diggers, and actually a chimney sweep who gave birth the afternoon he took her photograph, although you never know it from the photograph. But these are quite young women. They're quite cheery. They're very upfront about who they are. And again, they're wearing a uniform. They're doing a public service. And that idea of war workers, war service is very strong in the First World War. And as far as we can tell, it's something to some extent that many of these war workers feel for themselves. They're very proud to be helping out, to be participating. When asked, they don't by and large talk about patriotism, king and country. They talk about, they use the slogan of the advertisements of the Ministry of Information, doing your bit. They don't by and large say for king and country, but they talk about family and home, as the soldiers themselves do. And we find that after the war, Cambridge sees a slightly new spirit abroad. That air of desperate quiet and weariness that Jeb had observed in 1906, and that others had observed in the papers of the Charity Organisation Society, a sort of desperation for women, of a failure to enjoy leisure or pleasure. That seems to some extent to have gone, and we even find in a rather remarkable turn-up for the books, in 1919, there are 2 strikes involving bedders. One is in 1919, and it starts partly because Leah Manning, who's my second heroine in this story, a school teacher who was born 10 years after Eglantine Jebb, trained in Teacher Training College here in Cambridge at Homerton, and went, when she wanted to get a job, she was qualified, she'd passed the exam very high, and she could have gone to London to a good secondary school, teaching girls in a secondary school. And her mentor said, why don't you go and teach in New Street, in the school, the council school, famously rough school. She goes to New Street and she finds children who are 70 to 80 to a class, who are too hungry to study. I'll talk later about what she does about them. But she has become, during her training years, a member of what is not then the Labour Representation Committee, and later she becomes, in 1918, she becomes a member of the new Labour Party. And she is exceptionally critical of the social conditions of working class Cambridge that she has seen during her glorious years as a student at Homerton, where she acted in the ADC and wrote journalism and went out and leafleted for good political causes. She also looked about her and saw the poor social conditions. And she got involved with the National Federation of Women Workers. Now this, founded in 1906, is a trade union for women in jobs where the unions do not admit women. So it's a place where women can achieve the benefits of trade unionism to defend their working conditions in areas where they've previously been kept out, but are slowly being introduced in some forms of work. And we find in a newspaper, on 1st of August 1919, a report of a pleasing function at the Labour Exchange when the Trinity and Emmanuel members of the NFWW branch presented Mrs. Manning, their president, with a silver mustard, pepper and salt service as a recognition of the token of their appreciation of all the work she's done for them. She said it was nothing compared with the great deal she'd been able to put them into the way of doing for themselves. And I've contrasted that with a report of a meeting of the Poor Law Guardians. That's why I asked about the overlap between Poor Law Guardians and the CCOS, which I think is actually, in terms of the leadership of the organisations, the representatives on the Board of Guardians and the CCOS, is quite a lot of overlap. I think quite a lot of the same people are involved. This report is of sarcastic guardians who say that the health inspector, who said that the living conditions of people obtaining outdoor relief, that's what the Poor Law gives you if you're starving. They give you money for food and clothes and blankets. And this inspector goes into their homes, unlike previous inspectors, and looks at them, and she says they should all have at least 4 blankets to put on the beds in their houses, and they don't have this. And the Guardians say, and she says, this inspector says, they have an air of destitution, and these are people who are bed makers in Cambridge. They work for the colleges, but their wages at 2 shillings a week are too low, and that's the wage of a sweated worker in the sweated industries, of which there are not many in Cambridge. Many of these women are widowed. They're the sole support of their households. Most of them are too old to have been widowed during the First World War, but they were widows already and worked for the colleges out of need. And there is a bit of support for giving them those 4 blankets, but the Board of Guardians sarcastically tell the inspector that she doesn't know Cambridge and she doesn't understand the conditions of the poor, and they're not going to get their 4 blankets. Oh, sorry, going the wrong way. But Leah Manning also organises a second strike, a more famous one. among the bedders. And this is where the branches of Trinity, Emmanuel, St John's and Sidney Sussex, which are the colleges which most unionised in 1919, are still there. They're still members of the union. They're still interested in unionisation. She also helps organise the Chivers workers in a strike, which unfortunately results in a lockout and means the Chivers workers lose their jobs. And there's, I'm sorry, it's very difficult to see. It's in her autobiography, which is called, sorry, I always forget the proper name of this book, A Life for an Education. And it's next to page 64. And there she is. But it is a very good array of extremely respectable servants who wear hats and caps, and they're wearing their best hats. You know, being out on strike is an occasion for festivity, for celebration, for recognition. And that is why I see the First World War as creating a change in people's sensibility about their own work. But it doesn't make much of a difference to what work there is on offer in the city of Cambridge, in East Cambridge. It is still the case that women's main occupation seems to be what is called in the census home duties. I did a quick survey. It took me much longer than it should have done, and I'm very inept at it, of 30 households. And I chose Beach Road because a dear friend just died who lived there, Abbey Road and City Road. I thought these were fairly representative, respective working class streets. And in them there were 4 women, daughters all, who worked in confectionery shops. There were 4 women who worked in other shops. There were women who worked for the co-op, often following fathers into the co-op. There were women who worked as college servants, about 10 of them. There were people who worked in tobacconists, so shops, shopping. There were different kinds of servant, about 10 of those. But the vast majority said household duties or no occupation. Here is a chart comparing it's from the whole census. I'm sorry, I lacked the technical skill to pull out registration district 17, 18 and 19, which would have given me the people from Barnwell and get statistics that would have been in any sense meaningful. And this only applies to young women because the figures get more and more unoccupied the older you get. But the other difference between one census and another is that in 1911, it was taken as usual in the spring, in April, when the colleges were about, everything was in session. In 1921, for complicated reasons, it was taken in August, when there were no colleges around. So that you might think, oh, the First World War has meant that large numbers of women have stopped working in certain areas. Well, no, I don't think it is that. I think it is mostly the time of year. And I found some extraordinary things in 1921. I found a set of census returns of people on Midsummer Common who were clearly travelling people at a fair or a circus. And they didn't really have a house, so they said, and asked of the rooms, it was unclear, so it got crossed out. And all sorts of fascinating things like that. But of these, of my 30 households, the proportion of people, yes, dress and garment working, that was the other one I was fighting to remember. There were about 6 of those. But if you look, it goes down with age because the young are the ones in apprenticeships learning their trades. And when you get to 20 to 24, they're beginning to get married, they're beginning to leave formal full-time work. What I want to argue is that they're still working. They're working incredibly hard, and the more children they have, the more work they have to do. And Cambridge does have a slightly rising birth rate after the First World War, just as everywhere else in England does, from births foregone during the war, during conscription. But it's not a great big boom. We find that when the Cambridge Birth Control Clinic is set up, most of its clients, it's organised by another heroine perhaps, Lella Secor Florence, the American wife of an economics don living in West Cambridge, who comes to Cambridge and finds the class politics of Cambridge society deeply unappealing. And she's one of the people that, through the Women's Welfare Association, sets up this birth control clinic in Parsonage Street. And it is for married women only, and it is largely for women that have had children already and don't want to have any more. And quite a lot of them, and she writes this wonderful, another piece of excellent social science, she writes a study of the first 300 clients of this clinic and finds out that actually they're very glad to have the birth control, and most of them, when they go there, take it. But it's not very easy for them to use it. And so their control over their own fertility, although wished for and chosen and discussed a little bit with their husbands, sometimes, not always, but not with anybody else much, is incredibly difficult because they lack the privacy to use the contraceptive cap or the pessary or most of the things that are used. And men buy condoms, which is the most common, or other things. But, you know, so birth rates affect that labour, and they're affecting it. It rises slightly after the war, and the birth control clinic helps these few people successfully to control the size of their families or to stop having any more children altogether. But it doesn't have much effect on the birth rate, and the population is rising. The birth rate in Britain is tumbling because unemployment's rising because of a crisis after 1931. I ought to stop, oughtn't I? I'm way over time. I'm sorry, I'm not going to talk about pie and the Second World War, but I will leave it there. I'm really sorry.
For the rest, another time.
Yes,
for the next
another time.
part.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, time is defeating us. Are there any immediately germane questions that we could? No. That's a disappointment.
Well, I might have done more work then, and I could look at more than 30 households. I could get up to 300, like Lella Secor Florence or something like that. Yeah, that would be lovely. Thank you.
I think, yes, either society would be very glad to hear you at greater length when we've got more time to appreciate it and you feel you can put more time into it. So thank you very much.